If you have the courage to hear the full nightmare, stay till the end. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to uncover more terrifying stories like this. Have you ever moved into a place that felt wrong? I promise, by the end of this story, you'll never ignore the little signs again. Ethan had just closed on his new apartment in a quiet, modern building in Brooklyn, New York. The polished hallway smelled faintly of fresh paint, and the sunlight streaming through the windows made it feel almost too perfect. But as he stepped into the living room, something prickled the back of his neck. It was subtle at first, a chill that ran through his spine, the faint creak of floorboards in an otherwise silent apartment. Just my imagination, he muttered to himself, setting down the keys. As the day wore on, Ethan started noticing little things. The neighbors, people he had never met, would sometimes peek from behind curtains, standing unnaturally still, their movements jerky and disjointed. He shrugged it off. Maybe they were just shy, new in the building, like him. That evening, as he unpacked boxes, Ethan heard it, a whisper. Soft, almost too faint to catch. "Ethan." It seemed to come from the kitchen, though the lights were off and the apartment entirely empty. He froze, heart pounding, telling himself again it was imagination. By the second night, the apartment had begun to feel alive. Walking past the windows, he thought he saw shadows twisting across the streets below. The flicker of a light in a neighbor's apartment revealed a figure staring, motionless, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. His sleep was restless, dreams of being watched, of someone calling his name from just beyond his vision, left him gasping awake at 3 a.m. And then the light started, flickering first, then cutting out completely. Ethan would lie in bed, wide awake, hearing the soft drip of water from the kitchen sink that had not been leaking a moment before. When he stumbled out to check, the water stopped as soon as the lights came back on. It wasn't plumbing. It was something else. From that moment on, the apartment felt like a trap. The floor creaked as if footsteps followed him, shadows moved against his will, and the neighbors' movements became unnatural, jerky, almost predatory. He began to feel it in his bones. Something was watching, learning, and waiting. One night, after a series of flickering lights and whispers that called his name repeatedly, Ethan bolted upright from sleep. The room felt cold, his eyes wide with terror. He was pinned against the wall, feeling as if the air itself had weight, as if some presence was pressing down. And then, just as suddenly, a shadow appeared before him. Not a trick of the light. Real, darker than the darkest corner of the room. Ethan screamed, a blood-freezing, desperate scream, but even in his terror, he felt the story was only beginning. This was not imagination. This was real, and by the end, the apartment would show him exactly why. Ethan didn't sleep for the next 2 nights. Every creak, every whisper, every flicker of light made him flinch. He tried to convince himself it was stress, maybe the excitement of a new apartment, but deep down, he knew it wasn't normal. Something was alive in that space, something patient. The neighbors grew stranger by the hour. One morning, Ethan noticed Mrs. Holloway across the hall standing perfectly still in her doorway, staring at him. Her head tilted unnaturally, fingers twitching. Then, when he blinked, she was gone. He rubbed his eyes, heart hammering. That night, as he sat in the living room with the blinds drawn, he heard soft footsteps pacing outside his door. Not the usual apartment sounds. Something deliberate, something waiting. When he walked to the kitchen to check, the faucet had turned itself on. Water dripped slowly, rhythmically, like a heartbeat. He reached out to turn it off, but as soon as he did, it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than anything he had ever felt. Then a faint giggle echoed from the hallway. A child's voice, or something pretending to be one. Ethan tried to leave the apartment for a walk, to clear his mind. The building lobby seemed normal, quiet, but the elevator was different. The buttons flickered, some glowing red, others dark. When the elevator doors opened, he caught a glimpse of a figure, a man in a black suit, motionless, staring straight at him. The doors shut too fast, and when they reopened a floor later, the figure was gone. By the third night, the nightmares became unbearable. Ethan dreamed of his neighbors moving in grotesque, unnatural ways. Faces bending, shadows crawling along walls, whispers calling his name, laughter turning into screams that echoed in his skull. He woke up drenched in sweat, shaking, but the apartment didn't feel safe even in the daylight. And then the windows. Ethan looked outside and froze. The neighbors' silhouettes twisted into impossible shapes, arms stretching too long, heads tilting unnaturally. One figure pressed its face against the glass, mouth opening impossibly wide, silent but horrifying. He stumbled back, heart racing, and almost ran into his kitchen, only to see water dripping again from the faucet, though he had turned it off hours ago. Something in the apartment was learning him. It was testing him. Ethan felt trapped, watched, hunted. Every sound, the faint scratching, the soft humming, the occasional whisper, felt intentional. And the most terrifying part? The apartment seemed to respond to his fear. The louder his heartbeat, the more alive it became. That night, Ethan sat against the wall, trembling. The shadows seemed to gather in the corners, stretching closer to him. A window slid open by itself, the cold night air brushing his face. And then a hand-shaped shadow appeared on the wall, stretching impossibly tall, reaching toward him. Ethan realized one thing. He was no longer just living in the apartment. He was a part of it. And the apartment was just beginning to show him why no one had ever truly left. Ethan barely slept. The apartment's air felt thick, almost suffocating. Every shadow in the corners seemed alive, pulsating, creeping closer when he wasn't looking. He couldn't tell if it was the darkness or the fear inside him making the room move. The clock ticked slowly, loudly, each second echoing like footsteps pacing just behind him. That evening, Ethan decided he had to investigate the neighbors. Maybe seeing them up close would explain the strange behavior, or at least distract him from the creeping dread. He walked quietly to Mrs. Holloway's door, listening. The apartment was silent, too silent. And then a faint humming started. A soft, eerie tune, just barely audible, coming from somewhere inside. He knocked lightly. No answer. He knocked again. The humming stopped. Shivering, he returned to his apartment. He tried to distract himself, turning on music, scrolling on his phone, but the sound of laughter started from the apartment across the hall. A sharp, chilling laugh, high-pitched and unnatural. He looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. The lights flickered. He blinked. Then he noticed it. Shadows moving along the walls, independently of anything that could cause them. Shapes bending, stretching, merging into grotesque forms. Sleep became impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw glimpses of movement out of the corner of his vision. Faces pressed against the windows, neighbors, but twisted, unnatural. Their eyes hollow, mouths opening in silent screams. When he tried to scream, nothing came out. When he forced his voice, it echoed, his own name, but warped, as if whispered by hundreds of mouths at once. The apartment started responding to him in strange ways. The kitchen faucet turned on randomly, dripping cold water onto the floor. Lights flickered in perfect rhythm with his racing heartbeat. A picture frame on the wall fell, though nothing had touched it. Ethan felt like he was walking inside a nightmare he could never wake from. Then came the whispers. Clear, deliberate, calling his name. Ethan, Ethan. They seemed to come from the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath him. He grabbed a flashlight, moving it slowly across the room, and for a brief moment, he saw a figure standing behind the glass of his balcony door. A tall silhouette, completely black, face featureless, but the eyes, glowing red, unblinking, fixed on him. Ethan stumbled backward, tripping over a chair. The apartment seemed to breathe, expanding, contracting. The shadows stretched toward him. Then he heard something he hadn't heard before, a slow, dragging step, right behind him. He spun around. Empty. And in that moment, the walls whispered, almost teasingly, "You can't leave." Not yet. Ethan realized something terrifying. This wasn't just an apartment. It was alive. It was aware. And it was feeding on him, his fear, his panic, his isolation. Every creak, every flicker, every drop of water, every distorted neighbor, it was all deliberate. He sank to the floor, shaking, whispering to himself, trying to stay sane. And yet, even in the darkness, he knew the shadows were moving closer. The apartment wasn't done with him. Ethan's apartment felt alive. Every corner breathing, every shadow moving, every whisper closer than before. That night, he decided he couldn't stay in the living room. He needed light, protection, some sense of control. The ceiling light flickered violently as he entered, then shut off completely. He fumbled for his phone. The screen glowed dimly, barely illuminating the edges of the room. And then he heard it, the softest sound first, almost like a chair scraping, then the slow, deliberate footsteps of someone, or something, walking toward him. Not human, he realized immediately. The pace was wrong, uneven, stretching the seconds unnaturally. He held his breath, heart hammering, flashlight trembling in his hand. "Ethan," whispered a voice, low and distorted, echoing as if dozens of mouths spoke at once. It came from the bedroom. The voice was familiar, eerily intimate, like someone who knew him, but it wasn't human. He froze, his body refusing to move. The shadows along the walls began to stretch, elongating across the floor like black fingers reaching for him. Ethan backed into the corner, trying to make himself small, trying to disappear. The temperature dropped. Frost formed on the window edges despite the warm Brooklyn night. A low hum filled the air, vibrating in his chest, making it impossible to focus. Then the kitchen faucet turned on again. Water poured out violently this time, splashing across the floor even though he hadn't touched it. He ran toward it, tripped over a chair, and slid to the floor. The faucet shut off as soon as he touched it. But the apartment wasn't done. A shadow coalesced near the hallway. Tall, black, featureless, but undeniably alive. It moved with impossible speed, stopping inches from him. Ethan screamed, a raw, blood-curdling scream, but it didn't matter. The shadow paused, as if savoring the sound, and then suddenly dissipated, leaving only a cold emptiness. Ethan's phone buzzed. A message. He hesitated. With trembling hands, he unlocked it. It was from an unknown number. "Why are you here alone?" He dropped the phone. The lights in the apartment flickered violently, then cut out. Total darkness. The whispers came back, louder, circling him from all directions. "Ethan, Ethan," they were inside his head now. Every attempt to think, to calm himself, was drowned by the voices. And then he heard the window shatter. Something pressed its face against the glass. Neighbors? No. Too distorted, impossible, eyes glowing faintly red. He realized with horror that every sound, every flicker, every movement had been leading up to this. The apartment wasn't just alive, it was hunting him, isolating him, breaking him down. Ethan backed into the corner, shaking uncontrollably, eyes wide in terror. The shadows began to converge, creeping along the floor, up the walls, toward him. And in that moment, he knew one terrible truth. He was trapped, completely alone, and the apartment had only just begun to play its game. Ethan didn't sleep that night. The shadows in the apartment seemed almost sentient now, stretching unnaturally across the walls, pressing closer when he tried to sit, receding only when he held his breath. Every flicker of the light made the corners alive, writhing, as if waiting for him to make a mistake. By 2 a.m., the whispers were relentless. "Ethan, come closer," they hissed, echoing from the ceiling, the floor, the walls themselves. He wrapped his arms around himself, rocking slightly, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. Then he saw it, his reflection in the living room window. At first, he thought it was him, but the eyes staring back weren't his. They were hollow, dark, with tiny pinpoints of red glowing from the sockets. The mouth was slightly open, moving silently, shaping words he could almost hear. "You belong here." Panicking, Ethan spun around. The apartment was empty, or so it seemed. The faucet in the kitchen turned on again, water dripping violently, though he hadn't touched it. He ran to the sink, shut it off, and as soon as he did, the faucet slammed back on, flooding the floor. He stumbled backward, the cold water soaking his socks, heart racing, chest tight. A shadow moved across the ceiling, long, twisting, bending impossibly. It slithered toward him, and for a moment, Ethan felt frozen, paralyzed by pure terror. He tried to scream, tried to call for help, but his voice caught in his throat. And then a laugh erupted, a soft, childlike giggle that warped into a guttural snarl in less than a second. It came from the bedroom. Ethan turned toward the doorway. The hallway was empty. Then the closet door creaked open slowly, and he saw it. A figure crouched inside. Motionless. Black. Faceless. Just a shadow of a human, yet undeniably alive. He blinked. When he looked again, it was gone. Shaking, Ethan moved to the living room window. Outside, the street seemed normal, quiet, empty, but the building across from him was different. Every neighbor's window was dark, except one. The silhouette of a figure pressed against the glass, head tilted unnaturally. It waved, or tried to, but the motion was all wrong, jerky, impossible. He stumbled back, bumping into the wall. His eyes caught movement in the corner of the room. Another shadow, slowly creeping along the baseboards, heading toward him. The whispers intensified. "You cannot leave. You cannot leave." Ethan realized he was no longer in control. The apartment was dictating everything. The lights, the sounds, even the reflections. His own perception was being twisted. Every object, every shadow, every neighbor outside or inside. The apartment was teaching him that nothing was real, nothing was safe. And then he saw it again in the window. His own face, but twisted, eyes hollow, screaming silently, pressed against the glass as if begging for help. Ethan screamed too, a raw, human sound, and the apartment seemed to shudder in response. He collapsed to the floor, drenched, shaking, knowing one terrifying truth. The apartment was no longer just around him. It was inside him. Ethan had lost track of time. The apartment no longer followed the rhythm of day and night. It operated on its own twisted logic. Every shadow seemed to pulse with life. Every whisper carried intent. Every reflection, every flickering light, was a warning or a trap. That night, he tried to sleep on the couch. The air felt heavier than usual, pressing down on his chest. As soon as he closed his eyes, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. "Ethan, why do you resist?" His name echoed around the apartment, bouncing from walls, ceiling, and floor simultaneously, disorienting him. Suddenly, the living room lights flickered violently and went out. Complete darkness. Ethan's ears picked up a faint scraping sound, slow, deliberate, circling him. His flashlight illuminated the kitchen, and he saw the faucet dripping again, though it had been off for hours. The water flowed in perfect rhythm with the whispers, as if orchestrated. Ethan stumbled toward the hallway. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls. One shadow in particular moved independently, slithering like a snake. He tried to step around it, but as he did, the shadow split, creating dozens of miniature forms that surrounded him. He panicked, backpedaling into the living room, only to find that the room itself seemed to have shifted, walls slightly bent, angles warped, doors misaligned. Then the whispers became voices. Not one, but many, distorted, layered, each speaking his name differently. Some pleading, some mocking, some threatening. "You cannot leave. You belong here. You are ours." Ethan's reflection in the living room window caught his attention. But it wasn't his reflection anymore. The face staring back had hollow eyes, a mouth frozen in a scream, and skin mottled gray, as if decayed. The reflection moved on its own, gesturing for him to come closer. He stumbled back in terror. A sudden noise from the balcony made him spin. The sliding door rattled violently. Outside, the street looked empty and normal, but through the glass, he saw silhouettes in every apartment across the block. They were all staring, heads tilted unnaturally, movements jerky and wrong, their forms stretching and bending as if reality itself refused to contain them. The whispers intensified. Ethan's chest heaved. The walls seemed to close in. The ceiling sagged, the floorboards creaked unnaturally, and the faucet started dripping violently again, flooding the kitchen. His own voice began echoing back at him from nowhere. "Ethan, Ethan, Ethan." He realized the horrifying truth. This wasn't just an apartment. It was a predator. It didn't merely observe. It toyed, learned, manipulated, and fed on his fear. Every shadow, every flicker of light, every neighborly glance or distorted reflection was designed to break him completely. Ethan sank to the floor, shaking uncontrollably. The shadows converged, creeping along the walls and baseboards like living fingers. He pressed himself into the corner, heart hammering, lungs burning, knowing that the apartment's patience was infinite, and his terror was just beginning. The apartment wasn't done with him, and Ethan understood, with absolute certainty, that he would never leave the same. If he ever left at all, Ethan had lost all sense of time. The apartment no longer felt like a home. It was a living, breathing entity. Shadows stretched across walls at impossible angles, whispering his name relentlessly. The air was thick, oppressive, almost wet, pressing against his skin. Every sound, the dripping faucet, the distant hum of lights, the soft scratching of floors, felt intentional, orchestrated to terrorize him. Suddenly, the living room lights cut out completely. Ethan fumbled for his flashlight, shaking violently. The beam illuminated the hallway, and his blood ran cold. Every neighbor across the hall was standing perfectly still in their doorways. But their bodies were wrong. Elongated limbs, heads tilted at impossible angles, faces frozen in silent screams. One neighbor, a tall man in a gray hoodie, pressed his palm against the wall, the fingers stretching and splitting like black branches toward Ethan. The whispers turned into laughter, low, guttural, and human. Ethan's flashlight flickered across the living room, and he saw his reflection again, but it wasn't him. The reflection smiled, wide and unnatural, teeth jagged and black, eyes hollow and glowing faintly red. He screamed. The reflection screamed back. Then came the noises from the bedroom. Heavy, dragging steps, slow and deliberate, echoing down the hall. Ethan wanted to run, but the apartment had other plans. The floor beneath him vibrated slightly, and the walls seemed to bend inward. The ceiling sagged, dropping lower, the shadows stretching down like claws reaching for him. He ran to the kitchen. The faucet was on again, water spilling across the floor. He grabbed a towel to stop it, but the moment he touched the stream, the water reversed, spraying upward, soaking his face and chest. The shadows behind the counter shifted, forming shapes, twisted humanoid figures that seemed almost alive. Ethan bolted toward the balcony. The sliding door rattled violently. Outside, the street looked normal, but every window in the building across the street was lit with shadows, all staring at him. One figure lifted its arm, pointing directly at him. Another pressed its face against the glass, mouth opening impossibly wide. And then the apartment did something new. The walls whispered his deepest fears. His name repeated over and over, layered with laughter, crying, and moaning. The floorboards creaked like bones snapping. The ceiling groaned. And Ethan realized the horrifying truth. The apartment was no longer just around him. It had invaded his mind. He fell to the floor, shaking uncontrollably, unable to move. The shadows gathered, converging into a single dark mass in the center of the room. It writhed, stretching, expanding, as if alive. Then, a hand shot out, a shadowy, featureless appendage, reaching toward him. Ethan's scream echoed, raw and terrified. And just as the shadow's fingers brushed his shoulder, everything stopped. The apartment fell silent. The shadows froze. The faucet stopped dripping. The lights stabilized. Ethan lay on the floor, drenched in sweat, heart hammering, staring at nothing. But deep down, he knew the apartment wasn't done. It was patient. It was waiting. And whatever came next would be worse than anything he had already endured. Ethan sat on the floor, drenched, trembling, shadows frozen around him. For a moment, there was silence, so absolute it pressed against his skull. He dared to breathe. He dared to hope. Maybe it had ended. Then the whispers returned. Softer this time, almost intimate. You thought it was over? The faucet in the kitchen gurgled, spilling water slowly onto the floor. The walls pulsed subtly, as if the apartment itself had a heartbeat. Ethan's stomach twisted. He knew better than to think he was safe. He staggered to the window, hoping to see the street, hoping for normalcy. But outside, everything was wrong. The neighboring buildings stretched impossibly, as if reality itself had warped. Shadows moved unnaturally in every lit window. One figure turned its head toward him, tilting it at an impossible angle, and whispered in a voice that sounded exactly like his own, "You belong here." Ethan stumbled back, his flashlight flickering, and tripped over the corner of the couch. He landed hard, head spinning. The apartment seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper, pressing closer. Then the reflection in the living room window caught his attention. At first, he thought he was seeing himself, but the figure behind the glass was different. Its eyes were hollow, black, unblinking. Its mouth moved in silence, forming words Ethan somehow heard in his mind. "You cannot escape." Panicked, Ethan ran to the balcony, throwing the sliding door open. Cold air hit his face, but outside, the city looked normal. The streetlights glowed softly. Nothing moved. Relief washed over him. Maybe he had dreamt it all. Then he looked down at his own reflection in the glass balcony railing and froze. Behind him, in the apartment he thought he had left, shadows gathered. Figures, neighbors, twisted, elongated, faceless, stood perfectly still, watching. One stepped forward, pressing a hand against the balcony door. The hand passed through the glass as if it were liquid. Ethan's scream tore from his throat, but before he could react, a cold force slammed into him, dragging him back. He hit the floor inside the apartment. His heart pounded violently. The shadows now surrounded him completely, pressing in from every wall, ceiling, and floorboard. The whispers grew into a chorus. "You cannot leave. You cannot leave. You cannot leave." Ethan tried to move, but his body was paralyzed. He clawed at the walls, at the floor, at anything. But the shadows seemed to absorb his energy, feeding on his fear, growing larger, stronger. He realized, in the pit of his stomach, that the apartment had never been empty. It had been waiting, watching, learning, and now it had claimed him. As he lay there, trapped, the shadows shifted, coalescing into one massive, featureless shape. Its glowing red eyes locked onto him, unblinking. And then, as the apartment seemed to close around him, Ethan's own reflection in the window, hollow, screaming, eyes black, smiled. A final whisper echoed in his mind. "Welcome home, Ethan." If you enjoyed this horror story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell icon for more terrifying stories.